If you play Yu-Gi-Oh! In the TCG, you're probably used to players citing the OCG in regards to what's coming next in the competitive landscape. For as far as I can remember, duelists have used the OCG as a blueprint to discover upcoming trends, tech choices, and even entire deck strategies like Diamond Dude Turbo, Runic Sprites, and Baboon Burn. And after all, why shouldn't they? The OCG gets over 95% of cards before the TCG, so their players get the test and use the cards months before we do. Why wouldn't we always just use them as a guide as to what's to come? Well, the simple answer to that question is because things don't always translate from the OCG to the TCG in the same exact way. Whether it be the impact of Red Eye's Dark Dragoon, the wide gap in success of the Lyriluce Tri-Brigade deck, or how quickly Gladiator Beast rose to dominance. Between TCG exclusives like Test Tiger for example, small but sometimes significant rule differences, or a completely different Forbidden and Limited list, the TCG and the OCG, while being the same game, are for all intents and purposes very different entities. Today's video will be another cautionary tale in the long history of how and why using the OCG as your Bible for the upcoming meta doesn't always work out. Welcome to another episode of the biggest flops in Yu-Gi-Oh! History, and today we'll be looking at the much maligned Crossout Designator. In this video, you'll learn a little bit about the card's backstory, how it completely warped the OCG's metagame, and finally, why the card failed miserably in the TCG, despite what some would argue a similar landscape and potential. If you're a newer player, you look at Crossout Designator and you see a blue-eyed, long blonde, glistening-haired knight in shining armor who perfectly exemplifies valor and courage. However, very old-school duelists like myself will also recognize a familiar and iconic face. 20 years later, and our brave knight still looks like he's in his prime, just as he did when he originally appeared in the Powerhouse Nobleman of Crossout spell card released in the 4th core Yu-Gi-Oh! Booster set for the TCG, Pharaoh's Servant, and Curse of Anubis for the OCG. A simple spell card designed to crush and punish an opponent who was playing defensively by destroying and banishing one of their face-down monsters. A very basic and simple removal card, but believe me when I tell you it was wildly successful in the first 2 eras of Yu-Gi-Oh! Whether torching flip monsters or just helping you push through your opponent's attempts at defending themselves, Nobleman of Crossout reached meta staple levels fairly quickly. In fact, the card saw so much competitive play, it was moved to limited status immediately following Yu-Gi-Oh's iconic GOAT format on the October 2005 Forbidden and Limited list. Nobleman of Crossout was truly an iconic spell, so of course 20 years later when Konami decided to unretire Yu-Gi-Oh's original Shining Knight, people were excited. What we received was a new age card designed to tackle new age problems, while still beautifully capturing the spirit of the original. Crossout Designator was a quick play spell that let a player declare one card name, then banish a card of that name from their main deck. The banished card would have its activated effects negated as well as effects on the field, and this would last for the remainder of the turn. Only one Crossout Designator could be used by a player in any given turn. To be frank, the card was pretty damn great, not just from a respecting the original standpoint, as it involved banishing cards as part of its effect and the blonde-haired silver armored knight, but the effect itself was incredibly useful and potent, especially in regards to one specific aspect: stopping hand traps. Crossout Designator released in late May 2019 for the OCG, about a month after Rising Rampage. During the Vrains era, hand traps became more popular and important than ever as nearly every meta deck played them. The shift to running numerous hand traps in the main deck was made even easier by Konami releasing multiple excellent competitive ones during this era, such as Infinite Impermanence and Fantastical Dragon Phantasme. With so many powerful and impactful hand traps in the OCG's metagame, duelists naturally looked for answers to combat them. Of course, the obvious pick for players was the all-world powerful Called by the Grave, a highly versatile card that, just like Crossout Designator, was a quick play spell that banished cards, negated effects for a turn, and very much excelled at shutting down hand traps. At first glance, you may be inclined to think Called by the Grave's effect lasts longer, and it doesn't require any specific cards in your main deck to use effectively. Why do they even need Crossout if this already exists? And while that is a fair thought, there were 2 reasons that OCG duelists instantly gravitated towards the card. 1. It stopped things that Called by the Grave couldn't. Again, Called by specialized in wrecking hand traps, but it didn't stop all of them. Remember those new competitive hand traps from the Vrains era I just mentioned, Infinite Impermanence and Phantasme? Well, Called by couldn't deal with either card. Unlike loads of previous hand traps before it, Phantasme was a monster that never hit the graveyard per its effect and rather summoned itself. Translation, you'd never get an opportunity to banish it from the grave to negate its activated effect. Infinite Impermanence, on the other hand, wasn't even a monster card at all, so Called by the Grave could never be used to stop it. Compare that to Crossout Designator that stopped every hand trap you'd see in the competitive meta, whether it was a literal hand trap like Impermanence, or a figurative one like Ash Blossom and Joyous Spring, Effect Veiler, or Phantasme, whether they hit the graveyard or not. The second reason they gravitated to Crossout was that it actually complemented Called by the Grave. Playing both cards in a single deck gave you the absolute most protection from hand traps imaginable, as it raised the odds of you drawing one of them as a solid answer in your opening hand. In addition, the pair worked if you drew both in the same situation. This allowed you to have protection against multiple hand traps, or use one to push during your turn, and then use the other to potentially stop an opponent's play during theirs. In the very first week of legal play, we saw Orcus duelists stuffing full playsets of Crossout Designator into their decks, and for good reason. The Orcus deck in the OCG had more full combo starters than you could shake a stick at. The Trickstar Engine, Scrap Recycler, Speedroid Terratop, and more, but it also had one enormous problem, a giant choke point that everyone knew about. That choke point was Orcus Mermaid, and it being stopped was disastrous for the strategy. That's why players opted to max out on Crossout and Called by in the deck, despite Crossout also requiring you to run cards in the main deck that under normal circumstances you might not. Ash Blossom and Joy Spring and Maxi were 100% bona fide staples, but other cards like Ghost Bell, Effect Veiler, DD Crow, Imperm, and others were not. This is why players using Orcus, Salamangreats, and soon many other decks would run a single copy of solid hand traps just in case their opponent used that specific card against them. In the event they drew said card, well, they were still solid answers that could be used to thwart an opponent's play. This trend of running one of hand traps in combination with Crossout Designator would soon grow to be one of the defining features of the OCG metagame, and would often be referred to as OCG ratios by us TCG players. Having to adjust your main deck and run odd ratios just to integrate a single card into your deck probably doesn't sound worthwhile, but it really was, and it's largely because of one little roach, or family of roaches. Let's address the elephant in the room, and the hand trap you've probably noticed by now I've barely mentioned: Maxi. If you've played in the TCG for longer than a few years, or even play Yu-Gi-Oh! Master Duel, you are well aware of how potent, divisive, format warping, and often game deciding Maxi is. In my opinion, easily the best and most powerful hand trap ever printed, and one that in nearly every format in the OCG over the last half decade has to be accounted for. Well, unless you're playing one of a handful of meta decks like Floowandereeze, Eldritch, or True Draco that are all largely unaffected by it. If you're playing anything else competitive in the last 5 years, there's a good chance that you'll lose to a Resolve Maxi, unless you either A, kill your opponent before they can effectively use all the cards and advantage gained from Maxi, or B, super lock them out of the game with something like VFD, Artifact Scythe, or Necrosh Djinn, where it doesn't matter how many cards they have, they auto-lose if they can't beat the lock. For better or worse, Maxi has either been the #1 or 2 most popular card in the competitive OCG metagame since the beginning of Reigns, with it often alternating with the highly versatile Ash Blossom and Joyous Springs. Ash Blossom's popularity is widely renowned, but in the OCG, it also serves as a huge Maxi counter, which cements its status. In addition to Called by the Grave and Ash, Crossout Designator was seen as a card with huge potential because of its ability to deal with the little bug that you have to be able to answer. I cannot stress this enough for the TCG duelist out there. When it comes to the OCG, answering Maxi is pretty much the difference between life and death, and OCG duelists build their decks accordingly. As the formats progress, Crossout Designator continued to prove its vital role in the metagame time and time again. The versatility of the card really shined, as for instance with Dragon Link later in 2019, it was used to combat hand traps that spiked in popularity at that time, such as Ghost Ogre and Artifact Lancia. Pure Zodiac of fall 2020, Crossout was used to answer the likes of Forbidden Droplet and Infinite Impermanence that could turn off Dryden and Zeus. How about the next year? Well, that's when Virtual World and Prank Kids of 2021 were using it for dealing with Nibiru and Droll and Lockbird. The decks could change, the popular hand traps could change, but the player's attachment to Crossout Designator remained the constant. In fact, the card was so overwhelmingly popular in the OCG that it was moved to semi-limited and even limited status on the OCG's January 2022 limit regulation list, which is where the card remains to this day. So if Crossout was so popular, Konami had to limit the card, which, by the way, hasn't stopped them from still using it. What went wrong in the TCG? How come you don't see it used in every deck over here? Right now, half the people watching this video are probably shouting out, "It's because we don't have Maxis, stupid." And yes, there's no point in beating around the bush. Not having a game warping card that year after year perpetually influences the TCG on the level Maxi does for the OCG means we aren't forced to main deck answers for said card lest we constantly lose to it over and over again. But I think it's more than that. This isn't something I can definitively prove, but I'll tell you what a friend of mine recently told me. In the OCG, they play not to lose, as opposed to in the TCG, where we play to win. Don't confuse the two, because there's a world of difference, and I think Crossout Designator is the perfect microcosm of this sentiment. Resolving a crossout at a key time, for instance, against Nibiru, if you were playing heroes, doesn't actually mean you win the game. It just means that you don't lose to Nibiru. TCG duelists have shown in the past they're willing to add additional or auxiliary cards into their deck, but it usually has to come along with tremendous potential. Look at Gem Knight Garnet, Destiny Hero Dasher and Celestial, or Dracoback the Rideable Dragon. TCG players gladly threw these cards in the meta decks and fully embraced the idea that they may be really bad to draw, but it was totally worth the risk because the upside of those packages was just so damn high. I believe Crossout failed to captivate the TCG because it's a card best used like insurance. It's there just in case something might go wrong, but doesn't actually do anything until that actually happens. Compare that to the Adventurer, Phoenix Enforcer, or Brilliant Fusion packages that all force you to run cards that you probably don't want to, but they also proactively make plays for you. I think further proof of this is the fact that those engines also required you to run far worse cards than the hand traps that are commonly associated with Crossout, but still, each was a massive hit competitively, unlike Designator. All this isn't to say that Crossout Designator didn't see any competitive TCG play, which it did, and actually still does at the time of me recording this video in Kashtira. But the hype on this card based on its sustained excellence in the OCG had just about everyone thinking that it was going to be a meta staple upon release.
Crossout Designator. Now, some people say that Crossout Designator is going to ruin the game of Yu-Gi-Oh! Others have praised it for making the game much more playable, and that's what this video is going to be about. We're going to be adapting to Crossout Designator, and I'm personally prepared to drop big bucks for this card because I've tested it on my live stream, and let's just say that I use this to negate Triple Tactics talent. It was marvelous when that happens. I used to stop Imperm, stopping Nibiru. There's a lot of cards that got weaker, and that's what we're going to talk about here today.
Yu-Gi-Tubers, Yu-Gi-Oh! Streamers, basically anyone with a platform within this community was squarely sold on Crossout Designator being a huge meta impactful card for the TCG. Don't believe me? Check out this article on tcgplayer.com that was written by the brilliant Hanko Chow, in which he wraps the article up by saying, quote, "Overall, Crossout Designator will be a game-defining card and is a must-have for any sort of combo deck," unquote. If you would have told us a month prior to this that Crossout Designator would have at best seen niche competitive play in the TCG, I don't think many would have believed you. I know I wouldn't have. And that's all without mentioning the around $100 per copy price tag the card sported for pre-sales. As I've alluded to numerous times, the hype was real on Crossout Designator. Sadly, its competitive play fell sharply after the first few months post its release, and to this day has yet to reach that competitive meta staple status that many predicted. I find it really interesting because I think that most in the TCG can agree that Crossout Designator is a really good card. But just like with the Yu-Gi-Oh! Forbidden and Limited list, I believe this is another instance where philosophical differences between the OCG and the TCG have us seeing things that are similar in very different ways. And with that, we are at the conclusion to this Yu-Gi-Oh! Video. If you enjoyed it, or more importantly, you learned something, let me know by giving the video a big thumbs up, and also leave your thoughts and opinions in the comment section below. Do you believe Crossout Designator was a flop in the TCG? Why or why not? Thank you for watching as always, and of course, subscribe for more videos like this in the future. And then of course, a gigantic thank you to my patrons. We could not do this without you. My old buddy and rival, Garen Williams, Brian Ford, Volnuff, Israel Diaz, Ernesto Sanchez, and then my Twitch crew, Akinasism, Big Pimpin', and Super Canadian. If you'd like to become a patron or learn more, of course, the link is in the description below.